You always make a mess. The words hit me like a slap across the face, delivered with the same casual cruelty as someone commenting on the weather. I never thought the people I raised with my own hands would make me feel like a stain on their perfect lives. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you for even a second feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep telling these stories that need to be heard. My name is Eleanor. I'm 74 years old, and I've spent the last 3 years living in what was supposed to be my sanctuary, the suburban dream house in Chicago that I helped my son Mark buy with every penny from selling the home Walter and I built together over 42 years of marriage. The morning it all changed started like any other. I was standing in Amanda's pristine kitchen, my daughter-in-law's domain where every surface gleamed like a showroom and every item had its designated place. The granite countertops reflected the early November light streaming through windows I'd cleaned just yesterday, trying to be useful, trying to earn my place in this house that felt less like home each passing day. I was making breakfast for my grandchildren, 8-year-old Lily and 10-year-old Jacob, the way I'd done every school morning for 3 years. Pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse ears because that's what made them giggle. Coffee brewing in the expensive machine Amanda had registered for at 3 different stores. Orange juice poured into glasses that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. My arthritis-gnarled fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the gravy boat, Walter's mother's gravy boat that I'd treasured for decades, one of the few items I'd brought from our old house. It slipped, just for a moment, just enough for a thin stream of syrup to drip onto the counter. That's when Amanda appeared in the doorway. She stood there in her silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly pension check. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught in an elegant ponytail. Her green eyes taking in the scene with the kind of cold assessment I'd grown to recognize and dread. At 38, Amanda had the kind of polished beauty that came from regular spa treatments, personal trainers, and the luxury of never having worked a day in a factory or cleaned someone else's house to make ends meet. Jesus, Eleanor. Her voice carried that particular tone of exasperated patience that had become her default when addressing me, like she was speaking to a confused child rather than the woman who'd raised the man she married. You could have burned down the house. The words stung, but it was the way she said my name that cut deepest. Not Mom, which she'd called me during those first hopeful months when I thought we might become family. Not even Eleanor with warmth or respect. Just Eleanor. Like my name was something distasteful she had to force out. I reached for a paper towel, my movements careful and deliberate, trying not to give her any more ammunition. I'm sorry, dear. I'll clean it right up. But as I bent to wipe the counter, I caught sight of my reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. When had I started looking so small? When had my shoulders begun to curve inward like I was trying to take up less space? When had I learned to make myself invisible in my own son's house? Amanda sighed, that particular exhale that communicated volumes about her patience wearing thin. Just be more careful, okay? We can't afford to replace everything you break. Everything I break. As if I was some destructive force rather than a 74-year-old woman trying to help with breakfast. As if the gravy boat I'd been using safely for 30 years had suddenly become dangerous in my hands. Mark appeared then, straightening his tie as he grabbed his coffee mug, the one that read, "World's Best Dad," that I'd given him last Christmas. He was 45 now, my firstborn, with Walter's strong jaw and the same blue eyes that used to look at me with such love and gratitude. Now those eyes seemed to look through me, around me, anywhere but directly at me. What happened? He asked. But he was looking at Amanda, not at the woman who'd given birth to him, who'd sat up nights when he had fever, who'd worked double shifts at the diner to pay for his college textbooks. Your mother spilled again, Amanda said. And there it was, the way she'd started referring to me in recent months. Not Mom or even Eleanor, but your mother. Like I was Mark's responsibility, his burden to bear rather than a person with my own identity and worth. Mark's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought he might defend me. But then he simply nodded and said, I'm late for the Morrison meeting. Can you handle this? Handle this. Handle me. As if I was a problem to be managed rather than his mother who deserved basic respect. After they left, Amanda to her yoga class in her expensive Lululemon outfit, Mark to his accounting firm downtown. I found myself alone with the silence that had become my constant companion. The house felt enormous around me. All 4,000 square feet of gleaming surfaces and carefully arranged furniture that I was afraid to touch, afraid to disturb, afraid to exist around. I walked through the rooms slowly, my slippers silent on the hardwood floors that cost more than Walter and I had made in some entire years. The living room with its white sectional sofa that I'd been told was too delicate for me to sit on. The dining room with the mahogany table where I was allowed to eat only when the children were present, never when Mark and Amanda entertained their friends from the country club. In what used to be Walter's study, now Amanda's home office, family photos lined the built-in shelves, pictures of Mark and Amanda's wedding, vacation shots from places I'd never see, professional portraits of the children in coordinated outfits, and tucked in the back, almost hidden, one small framed photo of Walter and me on our wedding day, both of us young and hopeful and believing that love could conquer anything. I picked up that photo with trembling hands, studying Walter's face, wishing desperately I could ask him what to do. When he was dying, when the cancer was eating him alive one cell at a time, he'd made me promise to be happy. "Don't let them forget who raised them, Ellie," he'd whispered in that hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and impending loss. "Don't let them treat you like you don't matter." But I had let them. Somewhere along the way, I'd become so grateful for any scrap of inclusion, any moment of feeling wanted, that I'd forgotten I deserved more than just existing in the margins of my own family's life. The front door slammed, and I quickly replaced the photo, my heart racing as if I'd been caught doing something wrong. Lily burst into the room, her backpack sliding off her shoulder as she launched herself at my legs. "Grandma Eleanor, Mrs. Peterson said we're making Thanksgiving decorations tomorrow. Can you help me make a turkey with handprints like you did last year?" For the first time all day, I smiled genuinely. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll make the most beautiful turkey anyone's ever seen." But even as I hugged my granddaughter, I could hear Amanda in the kitchen, her voice sharp with irritation as she spoke to someone on the phone. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. She's here all the time, and honestly, she makes everything harder. Mark won't say anything, but I know he feels it too. We can't live like this forever." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I was the she in that conversation. I was the problem that needed solving, the burden that was making their lives harder simply by existing in the space I'd helped them buy. That night, as I lay in the small guest room that had become my world, twin bed, one dresser, a window that looked out at the garbage cans rather than Amanda's prized rose garden, I stared at the ceiling and finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding for months. I wasn't living with family. I was just an unwanted tenant in my own investment. And tomorrow, everything was going to change. The sleepless hours that followed gave me time to remember everything I'd tried so hard to forget. How did I get here? How did the woman who once ran a household, balanced checkbooks, and raised 2 boys become someone whose very presence was treated like an inconvenience? I remembered the day Walter's diagnosis came back. Stage 4, lung cancer. The doctor's words had hung in that sterile office like a death sentence. But Walter had squeezed my hand and whispered, "We'll figure this out, Ellie. We always do." But there was no figuring out terminal cancer. There was only watching the strongest man I'd ever known wither away, fighting for every breath while I held his hand, and pretended I wasn't terrified of facing the world without him. The medical bills started small. Co-pays here, prescription costs there. Then came the experimental treatments insurance wouldn't cover. The specialist Walter insisted on seeing because he wanted to fight for every possible day with me. I watched our savings account drain like water through a broken dam. 43 years of careful budgeting and modest dreams disappearing into the American healthcare system. When Walter finally lost his battle on a rainy Tuesday in March, I was left with a mountain of debt and a house that held too many memories to bear. Every corner whispered his name. His coffee mug still sat in the sink because I couldn't bring myself to wash it. His work boots remained by the back door like he might walk through at any moment, complaining about his supervisor and asking what I was making for dinner. Mark and Amanda had just gotten married then. They were renting a cramped apartment in Lincoln Park, and Mark's accounting job barely covered their expenses. Amanda had quit her marketing position to plan their wedding and hadn't found new work yet. When they started talking about wanting to buy a house, about starting a family, about the American dream that seemed just out of reach, I saw an opportunity to help the son I loved more than my own life. "Mom, you don't have to do this," Mark had said when I first suggested selling the house and using the proceeds for their down payment. But his eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen since he was 10 years old, and I'd surprised him with a bicycle for Christmas. "It's just money sitting in bricks and mortar," I'd told him, holding his face in my hands the way I used to when he was small. "Your father and I, we built that house with love, but love isn't in the walls, it's in family. It's in making sure the people we care about have what they need to build their own dreams." The house sold for $340,000. After paying off Walter's medical debts and the remaining mortgage, I had enough left to give Mark and Amanda a substantial down payment on their dream home in the suburbs. A 4-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage, a backyard big enough for the grandchildren I hoped would come, and enough space for an old woman who no longer had anywhere else to go. "You'll always have a place with us, Mom," Mark had promised as we stood in the empty living room of my old house one last time. Always. "This isn't goodbye to having a home. It's hello to a better one." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. The first year had been magical. Amanda was pregnant with Jacob, glowing with that particular radiance of first-time motherhood. She called me Mom and meant it, asking my advice about everything from morning sickness remedies to nursery colors. I felt needed, wanted, essential to their growing family. I cooked dinner most nights. Real meals, not the processed convenience foods that seemed to make up so much of their diet. I did laundry, folded tiny baby clothes with tears in my eyes, thinking about how Walter would have loved to hold his grandson. I cleaned house while they were at work, maintained the garden Amanda had started but never had time to tend. When Jacob was born, I was the one who got up for the 2 a.m. feedings so Amanda could rest. I was the one who walked the floors when he had colic, singing the same lullabies I'd sung to Mark decades earlier. I changed diapers, gave baths, read stories, and felt like I had purpose again. But somewhere along the way, appreciation became expectation. The things I did out of love became obligations I was simply supposed to fulfill. When Lily was born 2 years later, I wasn't consulted about her care. I was just assumed to provide it. "Mom's here," became Amanda's standard response when friends asked how she managed 2 small children and a full-time return to work. Not, "My mother-in-law helps us," or "Mark's mom is wonderful with the kids." Just, "Mom's here," like I was a piece of furniture that came with the house. The shift happened so gradually I almost didn't notice it. Amanda stopped saying please and thank you for the meals I cooked, the clothes I washed, the children I watched. Mark stopped asking how I was, stopped including me in family decisions, stopped seeing me as anything more than a convenient solution to their childcare needs. The guest room that was supposed to be temporary became permanent. My belongings, which had once filled an entire house, were condensed into a space barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser. My books were packed away because Amanda said they made the room look cluttered. The quilt Walter's mother had made, a family heirloom that had covered our marriage bed for 40 years, was replaced with a generic comforter from Target because it didn't match the aesthetic. I started eating dinner earlier before Mark came home because Amanda said the kids needed a consistent schedule, and my presence at the table made mealtimes chaotic. I was welcome to join family movie nights only if I sat quietly and didn't comment on the films, because apparently my observations were disruptive to the experience. The final straw had been building for months, 1,000 small cuts that individually seemed insignificant, but together formed a pattern of systematic exclusion. Last month, when Lily's school had a grandparents' day, I wasn't invited. Amanda said it would be too complicated to coordinate, even though I'd been the one helping with Lily's homework every evening. When Jacob's soccer team had a family barbecue, I was told I could come, but that there probably wouldn't be anywhere for me to sit. When Amanda's book club met at the house, my contribution to their down payment apparently buying me no rights to common areas, I was asked to find somewhere else to be for the evening. 3 weeks ago, I'd come down with a terrible flu, fever, chills, body aches that made every movement agony. I'd stayed in my room for 4 days, emerging only to use the bathroom, too weak to do much more than sleep. No one checked on me. No one brought me soup or medicine or even a glass of water. On the 5th day, when I finally felt strong enough to venture downstairs, Amanda's first words weren't concern for my health. They were irritation that I hadn't been available to watch the children, forcing her to call in sick from work. "I needed you," she'd said, as if my illness was a personal inconvenience rather than a medical condition. "The kids were asking where you were, and I didn't know what to tell them." That night, as I lay in my narrow bed listening to the sounds of the family I'd helped create but was no longer truly part of, a question formed in my mind that I couldn't shake. Was I used? The thought felt like betrayal at first. How could I even consider that Mark, my Mark, who I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through countless childhood illnesses, supported through college and career and marriage? How could I think he would use me? But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, the way family plans were made without consulting me, then presented as fait accompli, the way my contributions, financial, domestic, emotional, were taken for granted while my needs and feelings seemed entirely irrelevant. I thought about Walter, about what he would say if he could see how his son was treating the woman who'd given him everything. Walter, who'd held my hand through 50 years of marriage and never once made me feel like a burden or an inconvenience. Outside my window, snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season. Soon it would be Thanksgiving, then Christmas, then another year of living as a ghost in my own family's life. But as I watched those snowflakes drift past the glass, something inside me began to shift. A tiny spark of the woman I used to be, the woman who'd run a household, raised 2 children, survived the Depression and World War II rationing and her husband's death, began to flicker back to life. Maybe it was time to stop being grateful for crumbs and start remembering that I deserved a place at the table I'd helped build. Maybe it was time to stop asking, "Was I used?" and start asking, "What am I going to do about it?" The Thanksgiving preparations began 2 weeks early, and I threw myself into them with desperate enthusiasm, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this holiday would bring us together as a real family again. I spent hours planning the menu, shopping with coupons I'd carefully clipped, preparing dishes that would feed Amanda's extended family and the friends she'd invited without bothering to ask if I minded cooking for 14 people. My arthritic hands ached as I kneaded dough for homemade rolls at 5 in the morning, the kitchen still dark except for the light above the stove. I'd been doing this for 3 years now, rising before dawn to start preparations so everything would be perfect when Amanda's mother arrived. Patricia Hartwell, with her designer handbags and subtle disdain for anyone whose husband hadn't been a surgeon. I was pulling the turkey from the oven when Amanda swept into the kitchen, already dressed in her burgundy silk blouse and perfectly pressed slacks. She looked like she was headed to a magazine photo shoot rather than a family dinner. Every blonde hair in place, makeup flawless despite having 2 children to get ready. "Oh, good, you're handling the turkey," she said without looking at me. Her attention focused on arranging store-bought appetizers on her wedding china I'd helped pay for but was never allowed to use for my own meals. "Make sure you carve it in the kitchen. Last year the presentation was, well, let's just make sure the platter looks professional this time." Professional. As if 40 years of cooking family meals hadn't taught me how to carve a turkey properly. I bit my tongue and nodded, watching as she fussed with the dining room table I'd set earlier that morning. She moved the centerpiece I'd carefully arranged, autumn leaves and small pumpkins I'd collected from the yard, and replaced it with something more sophisticated from her collection of expensive decorative pieces. "Where should I sit?" I asked quietly as she counted chairs for the 3rd time. Amanda paused, her perfectly manicured fingers resting on the back of one of the dining chairs. "Actually, Eleanor, I was thinking it might be better if you ate in the kitchen today. You know how crowded it gets with everyone here, and you're always more comfortable in there anyway." More comfortable. As if being exiled from my own family's Thanksgiving dinner was somehow for my benefit. "But it's Thanksgiving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been cooking for 3 days." "I know, and we appreciate it, but Mom's bringing her friend Helen, and the Prescotts are coming with their teenage daughter. And honestly, there's just not enough room at the table for everyone. Not enough room. In the dining room I'd helped them afford, at the table that seated 12 comfortably, for the woman who'd prepared every dish they'd be eating. I stood there in my gravy-stained apron, surrounded by the evidence of my 3 days of labor. Homemade stuffing, cranberry sauce made from scratch, green bean casserole with the crispy onions Lily loved, sweet potato souffle that took hours to prepare properly, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Of course, I managed. Whatever you think is best. The guests began arriving at 3 o'clock, and I watched from the kitchen window as cars pulled into the driveway. The kind of expensive vehicles that cost more than I'd made in entire years at the diner. Patricia emerged from her silver BMW looking like she'd stepped out of a country club brochure, air-kissing Amanda like they were the stars of their own social drama. I listened to the laughter drifting from the living room, the clink of glasses as Mark opened the wine I'd bought with my grocery money, the compliments on the food I'd prepared but wouldn't be sharing. When Jacob wandered into the kitchen looking for me, I quickly shooed him back to the party. "Grandma, why aren't you eating with us?" he asked, his 10-year-old eyes full of confusion. "I'm just finishing up in here, sweetheart. You go enjoy dinner with everyone." But he lingered in the doorway, and I could see the questions forming in his mind. The same questions I'd been asking myself. Why was Grandma always excluded? Why did Mom and Dad treat her differently when company came? That evening, after the guests had left and the dishes were washed and put away, I overheard a conversation that shattered whatever illusions I'd been clinging to. I was in the laundry room folding the good tablecloth when voices drifted from the kitchen. Amanda and her mother, Patricia, lingering over wine while Mark put the children to bed. "I don't know how you do it, darling," Patricia was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured sympathy that wealthy women used when discussing other people's problems. Having her here all the time must be such a strain. "You have no idea," Amanda replied, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. Not physical tiredness, but emotional fatigue. "She means well, but she's from a different generation, you know? She doesn't understand boundaries. She hovers. She makes suggestions about everything. How I'm raising the kids. How I'm running the house. Even how I should handle Mark." My hands stilled on the tablecloth. Hovers? Makes suggestions? I thought I was helping. "And the financial situation," Patricia continued. "I assume she contributes to the household expenses?" Amanda laughed, a sound without humor. "She gave us the down payment, but honestly, that was years ago. Now she just exists here. She watches the kids sometimes, which saves on babysitting, and she cooks. But between you and me, her food is so old-fashioned. The kids are starting to ask why Grandma's cooking tastes different from everyone else's. Different. Wrong. Inadequate. Mark feels guilty, of course," Amanda went on. "But we both know this arrangement can't last forever. She's only going to get more dependent, more difficult, and eventually, we'll need that guest room for something else. Mark's been talking about a home office, and with Lily getting older, she'll need her own space. Eventually. They were already planning my departure, discussing my future like I was a temporary inconvenience to be managed rather than family to be cherished. "Have you considered assisted living?" Patricia asked. "There are some lovely facilities." "We've looked into it," Amanda interrupted. "But the good ones are expensive, and the ones we could afford, well, let's just say they're not places you'd want your own mother." But I wasn't Amanda's mother. I was just Mark's mother, and apparently, that distinction made all the difference in the level of care and consideration I deserved. I crept back to my room with legs that felt like they might give out beneath me, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it downstairs. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed and tried to process what I'd learned. They saw me as a burden, a temporary arrangement that had overstayed its welcome, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The next morning, I found myself staring at my reflection in the small mirror above my dresser. When had I become this woman? This gray-haired ghost who apologized for taking up space? Who cooked elaborate meals she wasn't invited to share? Who lived in constant fear of being too much trouble? I thought about Walter's sister, Ruth, who'd lived with her daughter's family after her husband died. Ruth, who'd been treated like the queen of the household, whose opinions were sought and valued, who'd had her own space and her own life while still being part of the family. The difference wasn't in our circumstances, it was in how our children chose to treat us. That afternoon, while Amanda was at her book club and Mark was at work, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I went to the locked filing cabinet in Mark's study, the one where he kept all the important documents, and retrieved the spare key from the hiding place I'd watched him use countless times. Inside, among the insurance policies and tax returns and investment statements, I found what I was looking for: the house deed, the mortgage papers, all the documentation from the purchase I'd made possible. And there, in black and white, was a truth that stopped my heart. My name wasn't on any of it. Despite providing the entire down payment, $250,000 of my life savings, I had no legal claim to this house. The deed listed only Mark and Amanda Harrison as owners. The mortgage was in their names only. According to these documents, I was nothing more than a tenant without a lease, a guest who could be asked to leave at any time. I thought about all those conversations during the buying process, all those meetings with real estate agents and loan officers where I'd been introduced as Mark's mother who's helping with the down payment. I'd assumed, God, how naive I'd been, that helping meant I'd have some security, some legal protection, some acknowledgement of my investment. But I'd simply been a bank, a convenient source of funding that could be discarded once the loan was secured. My hands shook as I photocopied the documents, not sure why I was doing it, but knowing instinctively that I needed proof of what I'd discovered. Then I carefully returned everything to its proper place and locked the cabinet, my movements mechanical while my mind reeled. $340,000. That's what my house had sold for. After paying Walter's debts and the remaining mortgage, I'd given Mark and Amanda $250,000 for their down payment, keeping only enough to live modestly on my pension. $250,000, and I didn't even exist on the paperwork. That night, I called the only person I could think of who might understand: Martha Coleman, my neighbor from the old house who'd become a widow 2 years after Walter died. Martha, who'd faced her own struggles with adult children, who seemed to think her independence was negotiable. "Eleanor?" Martha's voice was warm with surprise when she heard mine. "Honey, how are you? I've been thinking about you." Just hearing someone say my name with affection rather than irritation brought tears to my eyes. "Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course, dear. What is it?" "When you helped Tommy with his down payment, did you make sure your name was on the deed?" There was a long pause. "Eleanor, please tell me you didn't give them money without getting legal protection." The silence that followed was answer enough. "Oh, honey," Martha whispered. "What have they done to you?" As I told her everything, the exclusion, the dismissal, the overheard conversation, the discovery about the deed, I could hear the anger building in Martha's voice. "Eleanor Morrison," she said finally, her tone sharp with determination, "you call a lawyer first thing Monday morning, you document everything, and you remind those ungrateful children of yours that respect isn't something you stop earning just because you get old." After I hung up, I sat in my small room surrounded by the few possessions I'd been allowed to keep, and I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being grateful for crumbs. It was time to reclaim my dignity. Monday morning came gray and cold, matching the resolve that had settled in my bones over the weekend. I'd spent 2 sleepless nights rehearsing what I would say, how I would finally stand up for myself after 3 years of accepting whatever scraps of dignity they were willing to throw my way. The lawyer's office was downtown, in one of those glass buildings that scraped the Chicago sky. I'd found him through Martha's recommendation. David Brennan, an attorney who specialized in elder law and had experience with family property disputes. The consultation fee of $200 would strain my monthly budget, but some things were more important than money. Mr. Brennan was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard too many stories like mine. He listened without interruption as I explained my situation, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "Mrs. Morrison," he said finally, leaning back in his leather chair, "I want you to understand something very clearly. What your son and daughter-in-law have done, accepting $250,000 from you without providing any legal protection or ownership rights, it's not illegal, but it's certainly unethical. The word hung in the air between us like an indictment. Unethical. My own son had behaved unethically toward his mother. Do I have any recourse? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Possibly. We could argue that your contribution constituted a gift with implied expectations of housing security. We could explore whether there was an oral agreement that you'd have permanent residence rights. But honestly, Mrs. Morrison, these cases are difficult to win without written agreements. My heart sank, but Mr. Brennan wasn't finished. However, he continued, there are other options. You could demand repayment of your contribution as a loan. You could file a civil suit for unjust enrichment. Most importantly, you can establish clear boundaries about your living situation and financial support going forward. He gave me a manila folder filled with documents. Take these home. Think about what you want your relationship with your family to look like. Then decide how you want to proceed. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the only place I was consistently allowed to exist, and spread Mr. Brennan's documents across the surface. Legal terms and precedents, but underneath all the formal language was a simple truth. I had rights, even if my family had convinced me I didn't. I was still reading when Mark came home from work, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floors. He found me in the kitchen, briefcase in hand, tie loosened around his neck like a noose he was trying to escape. "Hey, Mom," he said, opening the refrigerator and grabbing a beer, the expensive craft brew that cost more than I spent on food in a week. "How was your day?" It was such a normal question, the kind of polite inquiry that had replaced genuine conversation between us years ago. But tonight, I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine. "I saw a lawyer today," I said quietly, not looking up from the papers. The beer bottle stopped halfway to Mark's lips. "A lawyer? Mom, what's wrong? Are you sick?" Still thinking of me as a problem to be managed rather than a person making decisions. "I'm not sick, Mark. I'm just tired of being treated like I don't matter in this house." He set the beer down with more force than necessary, and I could see his jaw tighten, the same expression he'd worn as a child when caught doing something wrong. "What are you talking about? Of course you matter. This is your home. Is it?" I looked up at him then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in months. "Because according to the deed, this house belongs to you and Amanda. My name isn't anywhere on it, despite the fact that I provided the entire down payment." The color drained from Mark's face. "Mom, you said that money was a gift. You said you wanted to help us get started. I said I wanted to help family. I didn't say I wanted to become a charity case living at your mercy." Before Mark could respond, Amanda appeared in the doorway, her yoga outfit pristine despite supposedly having just finished a workout. She took in the scene. The legal documents spread across the table. Mark's stricken expression, my calm determination, and I watched her perfect composure crack. "What's going on?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew this wasn't going to be a conversation she could control. "Your mother-in-law has apparently decided to consult an attorney," Mark said, and I noticed how quickly I'd become your mother-in-law rather than Mom when trouble arose. Amanda's green eyes flashed with something that might have been panic. "Eleanor, surely this is all a misunderstanding. Your family. We don't need lawyers involved in family matters." Family. She said the word like it meant something, like it hadn't been conditional on my usefulness and invisible when it came to my comfort. "Family," I repeated slowly. "Is that what this is? Because Saturday night, I heard you telling your mother that I was a burden you couldn't wait to get rid of." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark looked at Amanda with something approaching horror, and Amanda's carefully maintained mask finally slipped completely. "You were eavesdropping," she said, but there was no conviction in her accusation. "I was folding laundry. You were discussing my future like I was a piece of furniture you were planning to replace." I gathered the papers into a neat stack, my movements deliberate and calm. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Mark ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to think his way out of trouble. "Mom, look, maybe Amanda spoke out of frustration, but that doesn't mean—" "It means exactly what it sounded like," I interrupted, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't used in years. "It means you've been planning to get rid of me while continuing to benefit from my labor and my money." Amanda stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her like she was about to deliver a speech she'd rehearsed. "Eleanor, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Of course we value everything you've done for us. But you have to understand, this living situation was supposed to be temporary." "Temporary?" The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "Mark promised me I'd always have a place here. Always. That was the deal when I sold my home and gave you my life savings." "But people change," Amanda continued, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "Needs change. The children are getting older, and we need space for them to grow. You'd be happier somewhere with people your own age, don't you think?" Somewhere with people your own age. She meant a nursing home, some institutional warehouse where inconvenient elderly relatives could be stored out of sight. "What I'd be happier with," I said, standing up from the table with dignity I hadn't felt in years, "is being treated with the respect I've earned after raising the man you married and helping you build this life you're so eager to protect from my presence." Mark stepped between us, his hands raised like he was trying to referee a boxing match. Okay. Let's all calm down and think about this rationally." "I am thinking rationally," I said. "For the first time in 3 years, I'm thinking very rationally indeed." That's when Jacob appeared in the doorway, still in his soccer uniform, grass stains on his knees and confusion in his eyes. "What's everyone yelling about?" The sight of my grandson brought a momentary pause to the confrontation, but it also crystallized something important for me. Jacob looked between the adults, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, and I realized he was witnessing the exact moment when his family's foundation was revealing its cracks. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," I said gently. "Just adult conversation." But Jacob wasn't fooled. At 10 years old, he was already old enough to sense when things weren't right, old enough to notice that Grandma had been eating dinner alone, sleeping in the smallest room, disappearing whenever company came. "Grandma," he said quietly, "are you in trouble?" The innocence of the question, the genuine concern in his voice, hit me like a physical blow. Here was someone who actually cared about my welfare, while his parents were discussing my removal like it was a home improvement project. "No, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to his level. "Grandma's not in trouble. Grandma's just remembering that she's allowed to speak up when something doesn't feel right." Amanda quickly ushered Jacob upstairs, promising him cookies and avoiding the questions he kept asking about why everyone looked upset. When she returned, her expression had hardened into something I'd never seen before. Not just irritation or impatience, but actual hostility. "I won't have you upsetting the children with your dramatics," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Whatever issues you think you have, we handle them like adults, not in front of Jacob and Lily. Dramatics." Standing up for myself had become dramatics. "You're right," I said calmly. "We should handle this like adults. Adults who recognize that I've contributed significantly to this household and deserve basic respect in return." Mark sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, his head in his hands. "Mom, what do you want from us? We've given you a place to live, food to eat, a family to be part of. What more can we do? What more could they do?" The question was so fundamentally wrong that I almost didn't know where to start. "You could include me in family dinners instead of banishing me to the kitchen," I said. "You could consult me before making decisions about holidays and events. You could acknowledge that this house exists because of my financial contribution. You could treat me like a family member instead of hired help who works for room and board." Amanda laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Hired help? Eleanor, you don't pay rent. You don't contribute to utilities or mortgage payments. You eat our food and use our resources. Our resources. Resources I'd helped them acquire. And in return," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "I provide childcare that would cost you $1,500 a month. I cook meals that would cost another $1,000 if you ordered takeout every night. I clean house, do laundry, maintain the garden. I'd say my contributions are substantial." For the first time, Mark looked genuinely surprised, as if he'd never considered the monetary value of my labor. "Mom, we never asked you to. You never asked because you never had to. I did it out of love, out of gratitude for having a place to belong. But love shouldn't be conditional on servitude." The argument continued for another hour, circling around the same points like water spiraling down a drain. Amanda accused me of being ungrateful. Mark tried to play peacemaker while clearly taking his wife's side. I remained calm, stating my position with the clarity that comes from finally understanding your own worth. But it was what happened after they'd gone to bed that truly showed me where I stood. I was lying in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and listening to the house settle around me, when I heard footsteps in the hallway, whispered conversations through thin walls, the unmistakable sound of Amanda's voice, urgent and angry, planning something. At 2 a.m. I heard Mark's voice on the phone in his study, speaking in the hushed tones people use when they don't want to be overheard. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. He was calling in reinforcements. By morning, I knew exactly what those reinforcements would be. The war for my dignity was just beginning. The reinforcements arrived the next evening in the form of Patricia Hartwell and Dr. Richard Hartwell, Amanda's parents, whose combined presence filled the living room with the kind of authoritative disapproval that wealthy people wielded like a weapon. Patricia sat primly on the white sectional sofa I wasn't allowed to use, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her designer handbag placed strategically at her feet like a small fortress of respectability. Dr. Hartwell stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back in a pose that suggested he was about to deliver a medical diagnosis rather than participate in a family intervention. At 72, he still carried himself with the arrogant certainty of a man who'd spent his career being called doctor by everyone he met. I watched this tableau from the kitchen doorway, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, as Amanda briefed her parents on what she clearly viewed as the Eleanor problem. "She's become unreasonable," Amanda was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of long-suffering patience that suggested I was a difficult patient rather than a family member with legitimate grievances. "Yesterday she accused us of taking advantage of her, and now she's threatening legal action." Threatening legal action, as if consulting an attorney about my rights was somehow an act of aggression rather than self-protection. Patricia made a soft tisking sound, the kind of noise refined women make when confronted with unseemly behavior. "Amanda, dear, we told you from the beginning that this arrangement wasn't sustainable long-term. Elderly people often become confused about financial matters, especially when they're feeling isolated or unappreciated." Confused. They were already laying the groundwork to dismiss anything I said as the addled ramblings of an old woman whose mental faculties weren't quite what they used to be. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Hartwell called out, having noticed me hovering in the doorway. His voice carried the professional authority he'd spent decades cultivating, the tone that made patients comply with treatment plans they didn't understand. "Would you join us, please? We'd like to have a conversation." I set down my tea and walked into the living room, choosing to remain standing rather than taking the only remaining seat, a hard wooden chair that had been positioned to face the sofa like a defendant's dock in a courtroom. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Hartwell began, "Amanda and Mark have expressed some concerns about your recent behavior. They're worried you might be experiencing some confusion about your living situation here." Confusion, there was that word again, designed to make my legitimate complaints sound like symptoms of declining mental capacity. "I'm not confused about anything," I said calmly. "I'm simply tired of being treated like a servant in a house I helped purchase." Patricia leaned forward slightly, her expression radiating the kind of condescending sympathy that wealthy women used when dealing with less fortunate relatives. "Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? I think perhaps you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by the changes in your life, losing a spouse, moving to a new living situation, adjusting to a different role in the family dynamic. It's perfectly natural to feel disoriented. Disoriented. As if my objection to being excluded from family dinners was a symptom of geriatric confusion rather than a reasonable response to deliberate mistreatment. Mark sat in his leather recliner, the chair that cost more than most people spent on furniture for an entire room, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. This was his wife's show, her parents' intervention, and he was content to let them handle the unpleasant business of putting his mother in her place. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, directing my question to Dr. Hartwell, since he seemed to be the appointed spokesperson for this little tribunal. "We think it might be beneficial for you to consider alternative living arrangements," he said smoothly. "There are some excellent senior communities in the area, places where you'd have peers your own age, structured activities, Professional care if needed. Professional care. The euphemism for nursing home that made institutional warehousing sound like a luxury resort experience. "And what about my financial contribution to this house?" I asked, gesturing around the room that my money had helped purchase. "What happens to that?" Dr. Hartwell exchanged a glance with his wife, the kind of look that passes between married couples who've rehearsed this conversation. "Mrs. Morrison, from what I understand, that money was given as a gift to help Mark and Amanda get established. Gifts don't typically come with strings attached." Strings attached. They were reframing my expectation of basic respect and inclusion as some sort of manipulative contract violation. "I see," I said quietly. "So in your view, I should be grateful for whatever accommodation you're willing to provide, regardless of how I'm treated, because anything more would be strings attached to my gift." Amanda shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, her perfect composure beginning to crack under the weight of having her behavior examined so directly. "Eleanor, that's not what we're saying. We're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone." Everyone. Meaning everyone except the old woman whose feelings and preferences were clearly irrelevant to the decision-making process. "I have a better idea," I said, my voice gaining strength with each word. "How about I make a decision that works for me?" I walked to the front closet and retrieved my coat, the wool one Walter had bought me for our 40th anniversary, still warm and serviceable despite its age. As I shrugged it on, I could feel the tension in the room ratcheting up, their carefully orchestrated intervention suddenly spinning out of their control. "Where are you going?" Mark asked, finally finding his voice. "To the bank," I said, pulling on my gloves with deliberate care, "to open my own checking account and arrange to have my pension deposited there instead of into the account you've been managing for me." The silence that followed was deafening. For 3 years, my modest pension had been deposited into Mark's account, supposedly for easier household management. He'd given me an allowance like I was a child, for personal expenses, while the rest went toward household costs and savings I had no access to. "Mom, that's not necessary," Mark said, standing up from his chair. "We can work this out without involving banks and lawyers and making everything complicated." "It's already complicated," I replied. "The question is whether we're going to acknowledge that complexity honestly, or continue pretending I'm just a grateful guest who should be satisfied with whatever you're willing to provide." Patricia stood as well, her handbag clutched in front of her like a shield. "Mrs. Morrison, I think you're making a mistake. Family should be able to resolve these matters privately, without outside interference." "You're right," I said, looking directly at her. "Family should be able to resolve these matters. But that requires treating all family members like they matter equally, not like some are more important than others." I walked toward the front door, each step feeling like a small victory. For the first time in 3 years, I was making a decision about my own life, without asking permission or worrying about their approval. "Eleanor, wait," Amanda called out, her voice higher than usual, tinged with something that might have been panic. "Let's sit down and talk about this rationally." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. I've been sitting quietly and talking rationally for 3 years. Today, I'm going to start acting. The drive to the bank was the first time I'd been alone in a car in months. Mark had gradually taken over all the driving, citing concerns about my reflexes and vision, despite the fact that my doctor had cleared me for unrestricted driving at my last physical. Like so many other small freedoms, operating a vehicle had been something I'd surrendered without realizing I was giving up a piece of my independence. But my license was still valid, and my hands were steady on the wheel as I navigated the familiar streets of suburban Chicago. The Honda Civic that had been Walter's pride and joy, the car he'd researched for months before purchasing, comparing safety ratings and fuel efficiency like he was buying a home, still ran perfectly despite its age. At First National Bank, I met with Karen Stevenson, a customer service representative who looked about 35. With kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd helped countless seniors navigate financial independence after years of dependent arrangements. "Mrs. Morrison," she said after I'd explained my situation, "what you're describing is unfortunately more common than you might think. Many elderly parents find themselves in financial arrangements that seemed helpful initially, but become problematic over time." She helped me open a new checking account and arrange for my pension to be deposited directly there, starting with the next payment cycle. She also provided information about financial planning services specifically designed for seniors who were taking control of their finances after years of relying on family members. The most important thing, Karen explained as she handed me temporary checks and a debit card, is that you're taking steps to protect your independence. Financial autonomy is often the first step toward broader autonomy in other areas of your life. When I returned to the house 2 hours later, I found them exactly where I'd left them. Mark, Amanda, and her parents arranged in the living room like a war council planning their next strategy. They looked up when I entered, their expressions a mixture of anxiety and barely contained anger. "Did you really close our joint account?" Mark asked without preamble. "I didn't close anything," I said, hanging my coat back in the closet with deliberate calm. "I simply arranged for my money to go into my own account going forward." "But Mom, that account was set up for convenience, so we could manage your bills and make sure everything was handled properly." Handled properly. As if I'd been incapable of managing my own finances for the past 74 years. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I think I can handle writing my own checks and paying my own bills. I managed to do it successfully for 5 decades before moving in here." Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat, preparing to deliver what was clearly intended to be the final word on the matter. "Mrs. Morrison, this kind of impulsive decision-making is exactly what we're concerned about. When elderly people start making dramatic changes to long-standing arrangements, it can be a sign of what?" I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut through his professional condescension. "A sign of what, doctor?" He hesitated, clearly realizing he'd been about to suggest cognitive decline without any medical basis for such a diagnosis. "A sign of someone finally remembering that they're a competent adult with the right to make decisions about their own life," I continued. "A sign of someone who's tired of being treated like a child or a burden rather than a family member who deserves basic respect." That night, for the first time in 3 years, I cooked dinner for myself alone, not because I was excluded from the family meal, but because I chose to eat separately. I made Walter's favorite, beef stew with homemade biscuits, and ate it slowly at the kitchen table, savoring each bite and the profound satisfaction of having made a choice about my own life. The house was quieter than usual. No requests for babysitting, no assumptions that I'd handle the evening cleanup, no casual commands disguised as requests. They were learning, perhaps for the first time, what it felt like when the person they'd taken for granted was no longer automatically available. As I washed my single plate and put away the leftover stew, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at me seemed different somehow. Straighter, more solid, less apologetic for taking up space. I had taken the first step. Tomorrow, I would take the second. The second step came 3 days later, when I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I said no. Amanda stood in the kitchen doorway at 7:30 in the morning, already dressed for her day, makeup perfect, holding her designer handbag like armor against the world. "Eleanor, I need you to watch the kids today. My book club moved our meeting to this afternoon, and Mark has that client dinner tonight." She delivered this information as a statement of fact rather than a request, the way she'd been doing for 3 years. The assumption that my time belonged to them, that my schedule existed solely to accommodate their needs. "No," I said quietly, not looking up from the crossword puzzle I was working on at the kitchen table. Amanda paused, clearly certain she'd misheard. "What?" I said no. I set down my pencil and met her eyes directly. "I have other plans today." The confusion on her face was almost comical. In all our years of living together, I had never once refused a babysitting request, no matter how last-minute or inconvenient. I had canceled doctor's appointments, skipped social activities, and rearranged my entire existence around their scheduling needs. "What plans?" she asked, her voice taking on that sharp edge I'd learned to recognize as a warning sign. "I'm having lunch with Martha Coleman, my friend from the old neighborhood. Then I'm going to the library to research senior housing options." The last part was a lie, but it served its purpose. Amanda's face went pale, and I could see the panic flickering behind her carefully maintained composure. "Eleanor, you can't just... We depend on you for childcare. I can't cancel my book club meeting." Then you'll need to find alternative arrangements, I said, returning to my crossword. The same way you would if I were sick or unavailable for any other reason. But you're not sick. You're just being— She struggled for the right word, clearly wanting to say difficult, but recognizing that such an accusation might not serve her purposes. I'm being what, Amanda? Unreasonable, she finished, but there was no conviction in her voice. Unreasonable, I repeated thoughtfully. Is it unreasonable for a 74-year-old woman to have plans of her own? To make decisions about how she spends her time? Before Amanda could answer, Mark appeared in the kitchen, drawn by the tension in his wife's voice. He took in the scene, Amanda standing rigid with frustration, me sitting calmly at the table, and I could see him calculating the quickest way to restore the familiar order. What's going on? He asked, but he was looking at Amanda, not at me. Your mother is refusing to watch the children today, Amanda said, and I noticed how she emphasized the word refusing, making it sound like an act of rebellion rather than a simple decision about my own schedule. Mark turned to me then, his expression a mixture of confusion and disappointment. Mom, is that true? Why can't you help out? The question revealed everything about how he saw me, not as a person with my own life and priorities, but as a resource that should be available whenever needed. The idea that I might have legitimate reasons for declining hadn't even occurred to him. Because I've made other plans, I said simply, and because I'm tired of being taken for granted. Taken for granted? Mark's voice rose slightly. Mom, you live here rent-free. We provide food, utilities, everything you need. How is that taking you for granted? Everything I need. As if basic human dignity and respect were luxuries rather than fundamental requirements. Mark, I said, standing up from the table with as much dignity as I could muster. Sit down. Both of you. We're going to have a conversation that's 3 years overdue. Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the moment, because they both sat. Amanda perched on the edge of her chair like she was ready to flee. Mark slumped in resignation like a teenager being called out by a teacher. For 3 years, I began, I have cooked your meals, cleaned your house, watched your children, and asked for nothing in return except to be treated like a member of this family. Instead, I've been treated like hired help who works for room and board. That's not— Amanda started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. You've excluded me from family dinners when you have company. You've made decisions about holidays and vacations without consulting me. You've discussed my future like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person whose feelings and preferences matter. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but I continued before he could interrupt. Yesterday, I discovered that despite providing the entire down payment for this house, $250,000 of my life savings, my name appears nowhere on the deed. I have no legal claim to security in the home I helped purchase. The color drained from Mark's face. Mom, you said that money was a gift. It was a gift given with the understanding that I would have a permanent place in this family, a place at the table, not just in the smallest bedroom. A voice in decisions that affect me, not just grateful acceptance of whatever you decide is best. Amanda stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Eleanor, I think you're being melodramatic. We've never said you weren't part of the family. You've never said I was either. When was the last time you asked my opinion about anything that mattered? When was the last time you included me in a conversation that wasn't about what you needed me to do for you? The silence that followed was deafening. They looked at each other, then at me, clearly struggling to find an answer to questions they'd never considered. You want to know what happened to the woman who raised your husband? I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. She disappeared into the background of your lives, grateful for scraps of attention, and too afraid of being abandoned to demand the respect she deserved. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a manila envelope I'd placed there earlier that morning. Inside were copies of all the documents from my lawyer's office, along with some additional paperwork I'd requested. These are estimates for the cost of the services I provide, I said, pulling out several sheets of paper. Professional childcare for 2 children, 40 hours per week, $1,500 monthly. Housekeeping service for a 4,000-square-foot home, $800 monthly. Personal chef for daily meal preparation, $1,200 monthly. Total, $3,500 monthly, or $42,000 annually. Mark stared at the numbers like they were written in a foreign language. Mom, what is this? This is the monetary value of my labor over the past 3 years. $126,000 worth of services I've provided free of charge, out of love and the mistaken belief that I was contributing to a family that valued my presence. Amanda's face had gone from pale to flushed. You can't put a price on family helping family. You're absolutely right, I agreed. Family shouldn't have a price. Family should be based on mutual respect, consideration, and genuine affection. But what we've had isn't family. It's been an employment arrangement where I work without pay or benefits, and you get to feel generous for providing basic shelter. I set the papers down on the table between us, each sheet a small indictment of the way they'd treated me. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice calm but absolutely certain. I'm going to find alternative living arrangements. You're going to repay my financial contribution to this house, either through a formal loan agreement or by adding my name to the deed with appropriate legal protections. That's impossible, Amanda said immediately. We can't just restructure our mortgage because you're having second thoughts about a gift you gave years ago. Then you'll find another way to honor your obligation, I replied. Sell the house and give me my share. Take out a home equity loan. Figure it out the same way you'd figure out any other debt you owed. Mark finally found his voice. Mom, you're talking about destroying our family over money. No, Mark. I'm talking about recognizing that our family was destroyed the moment you decided I was worth less than the services I provided. I'm just finally admitting it out loud. The argument that followed was unlike anything we'd experienced before. Amanda accused me of manipulation, of trying to hold them hostage with financial threats. Mark wavered between guilt and anger, sometimes defending me, sometimes supporting his wife, always looking for a middle ground that would restore the comfortable dysfunction we'd been living with. But I remained calm throughout it all, stating my position with the clarity that comes from finally understanding your own worth. I wasn't asking for their love. That couldn't be demanded or negotiated. I was simply insisting on basic respect and fair treatment. You have 2 weeks to decide how you want to handle this, I said finally, gathering up my papers. Either we restructure our relationship to be genuinely equitable, or we end it entirely. And if we refuse, Amanda asked, her voice tight with barely controlled fury, then you'll hear from my attorney, I said simply. And you'll discover that 74-year-old women who've been taken advantage of can be very determined when they finally decide to fight back. That afternoon, I drove to my lunch with Martha Coleman, my hands steady on the steering wheel despite the emotional earthquake I'd just triggered. For the first time in 3 years, I was looking forward to spending time with someone who actually enjoyed my company, rather than simply tolerating my presence. Martha took one look at my face when I arrived at the restaurant and ordered us both a glass of wine before I'd even sat down. You did it, didn't you? She said, raising her glass in a toast. You finally told them what you really think. I did, I confirmed, touching my glass to hers. And I think I just burned down the last bridge to my old life. Good, Martha said firmly. Sometimes you have to burn the bridge to stop yourself from going backward. As I drove home that evening, I realized she was right. There was no returning to the comfortable servitude I'd accepted for 3 years. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, demanded respect that couldn't be forgotten, asserted worth that couldn't be ignored. Whatever happened next, I would face it as Eleanor Morrison, not as Mark's convenient mother or Amanda's unpaid domestic help, but as a woman who remembered her own value. The war for my dignity had become a battle for my future, and for the first time in years, I believed I might actually win. The silence that settled over the house in the days following our confrontation was different from any quiet I'd experienced there before. It wasn't the familiar hush of being ignored or dismissed. It was the charged stillness that comes when everyone is waiting for something to break. Mark and Amanda moved around me like I was a piece of dangerous machinery that might explode if disturbed. They spoke in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear, had whispered phone conversations behind closed doors, and treated me with the kind of careful politeness usually reserved for unstable strangers. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't walking on eggshells around them. On Thursday morning, Exactly 1 week after my ultimatum, I did something I hadn't done since Walter died. I made a decision purely for my own happiness. I called the number Martha had given me for Sunrise Senior Living, a community about 20 minutes away that specialized in independent living for active seniors. Mrs. Morrison? The voice on the phone belonged to Carol Peterson, the community's director, and it carried genuine warmth rather than the professional politeness I'd grown accustomed to. Martha Coleman spoke so highly of you. She said you might be interested in touring our facilities. I am, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. When would be convenient? How about this afternoon? I'd love to show you around and introduce you to some of our residents. I think you'd find the community very welcoming. That afternoon, I drove through the gates of Sunrise Senior Living and felt something shift inside my chest. Not the heavy weight of dread I'd expected, but a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The complex was beautiful, with well-maintained buildings arranged around courtyards filled with flowering trees and comfortable seating areas where residents gathered in small groups. Carol Peterson turned out to be a woman about my age who'd moved to the community herself after her husband passed away. She showed me through the various amenities with obvious pride: a library with reading nooks and large windows, a fitness center designed for seniors, craft rooms where residents pursued hobbies they'd never had time for during their working years. The beauty of this place, Carol explained as we walked through the central courtyard, is that it's designed for people who want to live their own lives while still having community and support when they need it. Their own lives. The phrase resonated in ways I couldn't fully articulate. When was the last time I'd lived my own life rather than existing in the margins of someone else's? We toured several apartment options, each one designed with seniors in mind but feeling nothing like the institutional settings I'd feared. The one-bedroom unit that captured my attention had a kitchen large enough for serious cooking, a living room with space for Walter's recliner and my grandmother's rocking chair, and a bedroom with windows that looked out onto a garden where residents grew vegetables and flowers. The monthly fee includes all utilities, basic cable and internet, 1 meal per day in our dining room, though most residents prefer to cook for themselves, weekly housekeeping, and transportation to medical appointments and shopping, Carol explained. But the most important thing we provide is respect for your independence and your right to make your own choices. Respect for independence. The words brought tears to my eyes. Can I ask what's prompting your interest in our community? Carol said gently as we sat in her office, the afternoon sun streaming through windows that overlooked the garden. I found myself telling her everything: the financial manipulation, the emotional neglect, the gradual erosion of my dignity until I'd almost forgotten I deserved better. Carol listened without judgment, occasionally nodding with the understanding of someone who'd heard similar stories before. Mrs. Morrison, she said when I finished, what you're describing is unfortunately more common than most people realize. Adult children who love their parents but somehow lose sight of them as complete human beings deserving of respect and consideration. She pulled out a folder from her desk drawer. We have a waiting list, but I have 1 unit coming available at the end of next month. The current resident is moving to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren. By choice, I should add. She's been planning this move for 2 years and couldn't be more excited. The apartment would cost $1,800 per month, less than Mark and Amanda were spending on their weekly dinners out and Amanda's monthly spa treatments. It would take most of my pension, but I'd have enough left over for personal expenses and small luxuries I hadn't allowed myself in years. I'd like to put my name down, I said, the words coming out before I'd consciously decided to say them. That evening, I returned to Mark and Amanda's house. I'd stopped thinking of it as my home, with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. They were in the living room when I arrived, sitting close together on the sofa with papers spread across the coffee table between them. "Where have you been?" Amanda asked, her voice carrying an edge of suspicion. "Looking at apartments," I said simply, hanging my coat in the closet with deliberate care. The papers on the coffee table, I noticed, were real estate listings. They'd been planning their next move too, apparently. Mark cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think maybe we can work something out. Find a compromise that makes everyone happy. Everyone." I wondered if that actually included me this time. "What kind of compromise?" I asked. settling into the wooden chair that had become my designated spot for family discussions. Amanda leaned forward, her expression carefully arranged to suggest concern and affection. "We realize we may have been taking your contributions for granted. The childcare, the housework, the cooking. We want to acknowledge that more formally." "Formally how?" "We're prepared to pay you," Mark said, as if he was offering me a generous gift. $500 a month for helping with the kids and around the house? It's not much, but it would give you some spending money and acknowledge that your time has value. $500 for services worth $42,000 annually. The insulting inadequacy of the offer was almost breathtaking. "And in return?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Things go back to the way they were," Amanda said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You stay here with us. We're all family together, and everyone knows their role. Everyone knows their role." I would return to being the grateful domestic help who worked for minimal compensation and no respect, while they continued to live in the house my money had purchased and make decisions about my life without consulting me. "That's a very generous offer," I said carefully, "but I'm afraid I'm going to decline." The smile dropped from Amanda's face like a mask that had suddenly become too heavy to maintain. "Eleanor, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to meet you halfway here." "Halfway would be treating me like an equal member of this family," I replied. "Halfway would be adding my name to the deed of the house I helped purchase. Halfway would be including me in family decisions and treating my opinions as valid and worthy of consideration." Mark ran his hands through his hair in the gesture I remembered from his childhood. "Mom, that's just not practical. We can't restructure our entire mortgage because you don't want to," I interrupted gently. "Not because you can't, but because acknowledging my actual contribution would require you to see me as something other than a convenient source of unpaid labor." I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in months. "I've put a deposit down on an apartment at Sunrise Senior Living. I'll be moving out at the end of next month." The silence that followed was deafening. Amanda's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something that might have been panic, while Mark looked like I'd just announced I was dying. "Mom, you can't be serious," he said finally. "That place must cost a fortune. It costs less than you spend on restaurant meals in a month," I said. "And unlike this arrangement, I'll be paying for a place where I'm welcomed rather than tolerated." "But what about the kids?" Amanda asked, and for the first time, her voice carried genuine emotion rather than calculated manipulation. "Jacob and Lily love having you here. The children are welcome to visit me anytime," I said, and I meant it. "In fact, I'm looking forward to having them over for dinner in a place where they can see their grandmother being treated with respect." Over the next 3 weeks, I began the process of disentangling my life from theirs. I opened a savings account and arranged for automatic transfers that would build an emergency fund for the first time in years. I researched activities at Sunrise, book clubs, gardening groups, art classes I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. Most importantly, I began to remember who Eleanor Morrison was when she wasn't defined by her usefulness to others. The woman who emerged from those weeks of preparation was someone I barely recognized, or rather, someone I recognized but hadn't seen in far too long. She stood straighter, spoke with more authority, and looked at the world with eyes that expected respect rather than hoping for scraps of consideration. 2 days before my move, Jacob found me in my room, carefully packing the few belongings I'd be taking with me. He stood in the doorway, his 10-year-old face serious with the weight of questions he didn't know how to ask. "Grandma," he said quietly, "are you leaving because of me and Lily?" The question broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. I sat down on the edge of my bed and pulled him close, breathing in the scent of grass stains and childhood that always clung to him after school. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, stroking his hair. "I'm leaving because I need to live somewhere I can be myself. Not because of you. Never because of you. But why can't you be yourself here?" Out of the mouths of babes. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the people who should love you most make you feel smallest? "Sometimes," I said carefully, "people forget how to see each other clearly. Your mom and dad forgot to see me as more than just the person who helps around the house. And I forgot to remind them that I'm a whole person with my own dreams and feelings and needs." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the serious consideration that children bring to concepts that challenge their understanding of the world. "Will you still be my grandma?" he asked finally. "Always," I said, hugging him tighter. "Being your grandma is the best job I've ever had. And now you'll get to visit me in my own place, where we can bake cookies and watch movies and play games without anyone telling us we're being too loud or making too much mess." For the first time in our conversation, Jacob smiled. "Can I help you move?" "I would love that," I said, and meant it with all my heart. Moving day arrived with October sunshine that felt like a benediction. Jacob and Lily helped carry my boxes. Not many, since I was starting fresh in most ways, while Mark and Amanda maintained the careful politeness that had characterized our interactions since my announcement. As I took a final walk through the house, I felt no sadness, only a profound sense of completion. This chapter of my life was ending, but it was ending on my terms, with my dignity intact and my future entirely my own to determine. The last thing I did was leave an envelope on the kitchen table, a check for 3 months' worth of childcare and housekeeping services, enough to help them transition to new arrangements. I wasn't being vindictive or cruel. I was simply demonstrating what it looked like when someone acted with the kind of consideration I'd been hoping to receive. As I drove away from that house for the last time, I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror and smiled at the woman looking back at me. Eleanor Morrison was finally coming home. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen at Sunrise Senior Living, making pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse ears. Not because someone expected me to, but because I wanted to. Jacob and Lily were coming for their monthly weekend visit, and I was planning a day that belonged entirely to us, without anyone hovering nearby to criticize my sugar intake choices or worry about messes on their precious granite countertops. My apartment had become everything I'd dreamed it could be during those dark months of feeling invisible. Walter's recliner sat by the window where morning light streamed in, perfect for reading the books I'd finally had time to explore. My grandmother's rocking chair held a place of honor near the small fireplace, draped with the quilt Walter's mother had made, the one Amanda had deemed unsuitable for her aesthetic. The walls displayed photographs I'd chosen myself, Walter and me on our wedding day, our boys as children before life complicated our relationships, pictures of Jacob and Lily from visits where they could see their grandmother being treated as the center of attention rather than an inconvenience to be managed. But the most meaningful addition to my space was something I'd never owned before. A painting I'd created myself in the art class I'd joined 3 months ago. It wasn't particularly skillful. My hands were still learning to hold a brush with confidence. But it captured something I'd discovered about myself. The painting showed a garden in spring, with winter-dead stems giving way to new growth, and somehow, in those imperfect brush strokes, I'd managed to express the way my life felt now. The doorbell chimed, a sound that always brought me joy because every visitor to this space was someone who actively chose to be here. I opened the door to find Jacob and Lily holding overnight bags and wearing the kind of excited expressions that children get when they're about to do something special. "Grandma Eleanor," Lily launched herself at my legs with the enthusiasm that 8-year-olds bring to everything they love. "Mom said you made cookies yesterday." "I did indeed," I said, scooping her up for a proper hug. "Chocolate chip, just the way you like them." Jacob, now 11 and growing into the serious young man he was becoming, smiled more quietly but no less warmly. "Hi, Grandma. Dad said to tell you he'll pick us up Sunday at 6. Mark had been respectful in our interactions since my move, though our relationship remained carefully formal. He'd never apologized for the way they'd treated me, but he'd also never criticized my decision to leave. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the boy he'd been in his interactions with his children during these exchanges, and I chose to hold on to those moments rather than dwelling on what we'd lost. Amanda and I maintained a polite distance. She'd attended Jacob's school concert last month, where I'd also been invited, by Jacob himself, not his parents, and we'd managed brief, courteous conversation about the children's accomplishments. She'd looked tired, I'd noticed, and I wondered if she was learning what it actually cost to manage a household and 2 active children without the buffer of unpaid help. But that was her journey to navigate, not mine to solve. "So," I said, settling the children at my kitchen table with glasses of orange juice I'd bought specifically because I knew they loved it. "What shall we do first today? Can we visit Mrs. Henderson's garden?" Jacob asked. "She said the tomatoes would be ready soon, and she might let us pick some." Mrs. Henderson was my neighbor, a former high school principal who'd become one of my closest friends at Sunrise. She'd invited me to join her gardening project within my first week of residence, and I'd discovered that I had opinions about soil composition and plant spacing that I'd never had opportunities to express. "After breakfast," I promised. "But first, I have something to show you." I led them to the small second bedroom that served as my office and hobby room, luxury of space I'd never had while living with their parents. On an easel near the window sat my latest painting project, a landscape I'd been working on for 3 weeks. "You painted that?" Lily breathed, her eyes wide with the kind of admiration that made my heart soar. "I did," I said, and I couldn't keep the pride out of my voice. "I'm taking art classes here every Tuesday and Thursday. Miss Chen says I have a natural eye for color." Miss Chen was the art instructor, a retired teacher who approached creativity with infectious enthusiasm. At 74, I was finally learning that it wasn't too late to discover new talents or pursue interests I'd never had time to explore. "It's beautiful, Grandma," Jacob said seriously, studying the brushstrokes with the attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "You should have a gallery show." "Maybe someday," I said, though the idea would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Now, anything felt possible. We spent the morning in Mrs. Henderson's garden, where the children learned about companion planting and the difference between heirloom and hybrid varieties. Mrs. Henderson treated them with the same respect she showed all visitors, explaining concepts clearly without talking down to them, answering their questions with genuine interest. "Your grandmother has the best instincts for plant care of anyone here," she told Jacob as he carefully extracted a perfectly ripe tomato from the vine. "She's turned that little patch by her patio into something worthy of a magazine." The pride I felt at that compliment was profound in ways I couldn't have explained to my former self. It wasn't just about gardening, it was about being recognized for skills and contributions that had nothing to do with my usefulness to other people's lives. That afternoon, we attended the community's monthly talent show, where residents shared poems they'd written, songs they'd learned, dances they'd choreographed. I'd never participated myself, but I'd discovered that I loved being part of an audience that celebrated creativity and courage, regardless of professional skill level. Mr. Patterson, a retired mechanic, played jazz piano with surprising sophistication. Mrs. Liu performed traditional Chinese dances that told stories of seasons and celebrations. Frank Rodriguez read excerpts from the memoir he was writing about his years as a firefighter. "Why doesn't everyone do things like this?" Lily whispered during a particularly moving poetry reading. "Because not everyone realizes they can," I whispered back, and felt the truth of that statement settle into my bones. For dinner, I prepared their favorite meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. But I served it on my good china because this was my home, and I could use whatever dishes I wanted without fear of criticism or spillage concerns. We ate slowly, talking about their school projects, their friends, their plans for summer vacation. "Grandma," Jacob said as I was clearing dessert plates, "can I ask you something?" "Always, sweetheart. Are you happier now? Living here instead of with us?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure an 11-year-old was ready to fully understand. But Jacob had asked with genuine curiosity rather than hurt feelings, and he deserved an honest answer. "I'm happier living somewhere I can be myself completely," I said carefully. "Not because I didn't love being near you and Lily, but because sometimes people need space to remember who they are outside of the roles they play for other people." "Like how I'm different at school than I am at home?" he asked, and I marveled at his intuitive understanding. "Exactly like that. Sometimes grown-ups forget that grandmas and parents and spouses are all just parts of a whole person, not the entire person." Lily, who'd been listening with the serious attention she gave to concepts that challenged her understanding, nodded solemnly. "So you're still our grandma, but you're also Eleanor who paints and gardens and has friends." "Yes," I said, feeling tears prick my eyes at her perfect summary. "I'm still completely your grandma, but I'm also completely myself. That night, after the children were asleep in the pull-out bed I'd bought specifically for their visits, I sat in Walter's chair with a cup of tea and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The financial settlement with Mark and Amanda had been resolved through our attorneys, without drama or courtroom confrontations. They'd agreed to a structured repayment plan that acknowledged my contribution to their home purchase, and while it wasn't the full amount I'd invested, it was enough to secure my future and preserve what remained of our family relationships. More importantly, the boundaries we'd established were holding. Mark called every few weeks to check on me. Genuine concern rather than obligation, I thought. And we'd managed to rebuild something that resembled affection, if not the closeness we'd once shared. The children visited monthly, sometimes more often when schedules allowed. They'd adapted to having a grandmother who lived separately with remarkable resilience, perhaps because they could see that this version of me was more present, more engaged, more genuinely happy than the woman who'd lived in their guest room. I'd made friends here, real friends, people who knew me as Eleanor, rather than as someone's mother or helper. Martha visited regularly, often joining our book club discussions or our bridge games. We'd developed a circle of women who'd all discovered, in various ways, that life after 70 could be richer and more fulfilling than they'd ever imagined. But perhaps the most profound change was internal. I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped feeling grateful for basic consideration, stopped accepting treatment that fell short of what I deserved as a human being with inherent worth. The woman who'd lived in fear of being too much trouble had been replaced by someone who understood that demanding respect wasn't selfish. It was necessary for any relationship worth maintaining. My phone buzzed with a text message from Carol Peterson. "Eleanor, we're planning a community garden expansion and could use your expertise. Would you be interested in heading up the committee?" 6 months ago, I would have hesitated, worried about whether I was qualified or whether others might have better ideas. Tonight, I typed back without hesitation. I'd be honored. When do we start? Because I'd finally learned the most important lesson of my 74 years. You teach people how to treat you, and it's never too late to demand better. The next morning, as I made breakfast for my grandchildren in my own kitchen, using my own good dishes, I caught my reflection in the window and smiled. The woman looking back at me stood straight, moved with purpose, and radiated the quiet confidence that comes from living authentically. Eleanor Morrison had finally come home to herself, and that journey, from invisibility to dignity, from grateful acceptance to righteous demand, from existing in the margins to claiming center stage in her own life, that journey was worth every difficult conversation, every moment of uncertainty, every bridge burned in service of self-respect. As I watched Jacob and Lily eat pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse ears, laughing over shared jokes and making plans for our day together, I realized that I'd given them something more valuable than convenient childcare or domestic assistance. I'd shown them what it looked like when someone refused to accept less than they deserved. And someday, when they faced their own moments of choice between comfortable compromise and difficult dignity, they'd remember their grandmother who chose herself and taught them that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt invisible in your own life, where your contributions were taken for granted while your needs were ignored? Have you watched someone you care about disappear into the background of their family's story, grateful for scraps of attention while providing everything they had? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes we all need reminding that it's never too late to reclaim our worth. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. These stories need to be heard because somewhere out there, someone needs to know that their dignity matters more than other people's convenience. And remember, you're never too old to start demanding the respect you've always deserved.